They thought he was just a fat black man in the wrong neighborhood, but what they didn't know was that he once commanded Delta Force. Blue and red lights bounced off the windows of the McMillan home. Sirens cut the air, sharp and unforgiving, even though there was no emergency. Denise McMillan stood frozen at the bottom of her porch steps, one hand gripping her phone, the other raised instinctively as if she could shield her 16-year-old son from what was happening. Across the lawn, Andre clutched his basketball under his arm, wide-eyed, not understanding why 4 squad cars had rolled up like he was a threat. And in the middle of it all stood his father, Terrence McMillan, a tall man with broad shoulders, a heavy frame, and a limp that carried the weight of too many years in combat zones. He had been walking back from the mailbox when it all started. Now he was facing 3 officers who barked orders as though he'd been caught in a crime. "Sir, put your hands on the hood." "Now!" one officer yelled, his hand already hovering near his holster. Terrence's voice was steady, but there was steel in it. "I live here. That's my wife. That's my son. I'm not doing anything wrong." But the officers didn't back off. Another one stepped forward, finger pointed like a weapon. "Identification." Right now, Denise's voice cracked through the night. "He's standing on his own property. You don't talk to him like that." Her protest only seemed to inflame the officers. One of them, a younger cop with a buzz cut, raised his voice even louder, demanding that Andre drop the ball. "You! Hands out of your pockets," he snapped, even though Andre's only weapon was the orange basketball he now held like a lifeline. Neighbors were peeking through blinds, some stepping out onto porches with phones in hand. A few whispered to each other, their cameras already rolling. The air was thick, not with crime, not with danger, but with fear. Fear that the wrong move could turn this standoff into something tragic. Terrence knew that fear well. He'd seen it in villages overseas when soldiers burst through doors. He'd seen it in the eyes of men who realized too late that they were out of their depth, but he never thought he'd see that same fear reflected in his wife's trembling voice or his son's shaking hands in their own front yard in a suburb outside Charlotte. The officer with the buzz cut moved closer. "I said hands on the hood," he barked again, and before Terrence could respond, the cop shoved him in the chest, trying to force him against the cruiser. Denise gasped. Andre dropped the basketball. Neighbors shouted. And Terrence? He didn't move the way they expected. He didn't flail or panic. He planted his feet, absorbing the shove like a brick wall, his eyes locked on the officer. For a split second, the cop seemed surprised that his push hadn't rattled the man in front of him. Terrence's voice was low, calm, measured, yet it carried the weight of command. "You're making a mistake." The officer smirked, mistaking Terrence's calm for submission. "The only mistake here is you not following orders." Denise stepped forward, tears streaking her cheeks. "Stop! He's not a criminal. He served this country. He's—" But Terrence cut her off with a glance, one he'd given countless times before in far harsher environments. It wasn't anger. It was a silent command. "Stay back. Let me handle this." Andre, however, couldn't hold his tongue. His voice cracked as he shouted, "That's my dad!" He didn't do anything. The words seemed to slice through the tense air, drawing every eye back to the boy. One officer looked uneasy now, shifting his weight as if realizing the scene didn't look right with all those cameras recording, but the others weren't ready to let go. To them, Terrence wasn't a father, wasn't a husband, wasn't a veteran. He was a large black man who fit the vague description from a neighbor's call. They didn't see the years of service, the scars under his shirt, or the fact that the calm in his voice came not from fear, but from training. Terrence's mind raced. He could end this in one sentence. He could pull rank in a way that none of these officers could question, but revealing who he was would strip away the very dignity they were trying to take from him. And once it was out there, it could never be pulled back. The crowd on the street was growing, more phones lifted into the air. The buzz of whispered disbelief traveled through the neighbors who had thought of this block as safe and quiet. Safe for who? Quiet for who? Tonight was forcing that question into the open. The cop's hand pressed harder against Terrence's chest, and for the first time, a flicker of recognition crossed his mind. This wasn't a fight with a stranger. This was a battle over respect, over identity, over the right to stand on your own lawn without being treated like a suspect. Terrence leaned slightly forward, his words sharp but calm enough to cut through the shouting. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The officer scoffed, thinking it was just another man bluffing, but the truth was about to come crashing down on this entire block. But before that truth could be spoken, the story of how the McMillans ended up here needs to be told. Months earlier, the McMillans had driven down a tree-lined road in Franklin, Tennessee, looking for a place where they could finally breathe. After years of military deployments and constant moving, they wanted permanence. Terrence had chosen Franklin because it was close enough to Nashville for opportunity, but quiet enough that he thought his family could fade into the background. When their moving truck pulled up on Sycamore Lane, some neighbors came out to wave politely. Others stayed behind curtains watching. Denise noticed it immediately. The difference between the smiles that reached the eyes and the ones that stopped at the lips. "This is it," Terrence had said, standing at the edge of the driveway, hands on his hips, surveying the two-story brick house they'd saved for. His limp was more obvious that day, but the pride in his voice covered it. "We're home." Andre had rushed straight to the backyard, bouncing his basketball on the cracked pavement, testing how far his three-point shot would carry. Denise followed, running her hand along the porch rail. "It feels good," she whispered. "Like we can finally stop." But stopping wasn't easy for a man who had spent 20 years in uniform. Terrence carried himself differently. He didn't chat idly at the mailbox. He didn't host barbecues. He wasn't unfriendly, just measured, deliberate, always scanning without realizing he was scanning. For some, that presence was comforting. For others, it was intimidating. The McMillans tried to blend in. Denise joined a local church group. Andre signed up for basketball at the community center. Terrence started physical therapy at the VA hospital in Murfreesboro. They were building roots, one routine at a time. Still, there were signs that not everyone was comfortable with them being there. One afternoon, while Terrence mowed the lawn, a neighbor across the street, Linda Robards, waved him down. She was in her late 60s, hair perfectly curled, pearls around her neck, even in the middle of summer. "You planning on keeping the grass that short?" she asked, voice polite but edged. Terrence paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yes, ma'am. That's how I keep it neat." She pursed her lips. "Most folks here leave it a little longer. Looks more natural." He didn't argue, just nodded once and went back to mowing. But Denise, who overheard from the porch, caught the real message. "You don't quite fit here, and we notice." Andre faced his own moments. At the basketball gym, a kid his age asked him outright, "You just visiting? Don't think I've seen your kind around this neighborhood before." Andre laughed it off, but later that night he asked his mom, "What did he mean, our kind?" Denise smoothed his hair back and said, "He doesn't know you yet, baby. Once they see who you are, they'll understand." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure if she believed it. Terrence noticed, too. He saw the looks linger a beat longer when he walked down the sidewalk. He heard the silence that followed when he entered a store. But he never spoke about it much. His focus was on protecting his family's sense of peace, not picking battles on every corner. "Let them think what they want," he told Denise one evening as they sat on the porch swing. "We didn't come here for them. We came here for us." She looked at him, eyes soft. "But what happens when their thinking puts us in danger?" He didn't answer right away. He just reached for her hand and squeezed it. Some battles, he thought, weren't fought with weapons or words. They were fought with patience. But patience only stretches so far. That summer, Denise noticed the same car driving by slowly at odd hours, a white sedan that seemed to pause in front of their house longer than it should. Once, she caught a man in the passenger seat scribbling something on a notepad. When she told Terrence, he brushed it off with a calm face, but inside he filed it away, the way he used to catalog suspicious movements overseas. Andre, meanwhile, grew frustrated with the way kids treated him. "I'm just trying to play ball, Dad," he said one night at dinner, "but they look at me like I don't belong there. Like I'm out of place." Terrence leaned forward, fork down. "Then you show them you do. Not with words, with how you carry yourself. Every shot you make, every game you play, you prove them wrong without saying a thing." Andre nodded, taking it in, but Denise caught the shadow that crossed Terrence's face as he spoke. He was teaching his son resilience, yes, but he also knew what it felt like to have to prove yourself over and over again, just to stand where others stood without question. For a while, things seemed manageable. The family carved out their corner of peace on Sycamore Lane, kept to themselves, smiled when they had to. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered, unspoken, unnoticed by some, but undeniable to the McMillans. But it only took one phone call from a nervous neighbor to tear open what they had tried so hard to build. It started with a single ring inside the Franklin Police Department's dispatch center. The call came from a neighbor just 2 houses down, a man named Richard Blakely, who described what he thought was a large, suspicious figure lingering in a driveway. He didn't say Terrence McMillan. He didn't say the homeowner. He said, "A big guy, looks dangerous." And that was enough. The dispatcher typed quickly, relaying the words into the system. Possible prowler, black male, heavy-set, late 30s to 40s, standing near mailbox. Within minutes, 2 cruisers lit up their sirens. Officer Darren McKee and Officer Brian Kellogg were first on scene, followed shortly by 2 more units. To them, it wasn't a quiet Saturday evening in a residential neighborhood. It was a situation that demanded control. As they sped down Sycamore Lane, McKee muttered under his breath, "This could get messy." "Let's get ahead of it." Kellogg glanced at him, hand resting near his weapon. "Big guy like that? Won't take chances." What they didn't realize was that Terrence had been walking back from the mailbox with a letter in hand, limping slightly from the ache in his knee. The letter wasn't anything special, just a utility bill, but by the time he reached the bottom of his driveway, the first cruiser skidded to a stop in front of his yard, tires squealing. Denise heard it first. She was in the kitchen rinsing vegetables when the sound of tires made her glance out the window. "Terrence?" she called, her voice sharp. She saw him turn his head just as the officers jumped out of their cars, hands already gesturing for him to comply. Andre was upstairs, sneakers half-laced, about to head out to the court when he heard shouting. He ran to the window, his stomach twisting as he saw his father surrounded. "Mom," he yelled, "something's happening." Denise dropped the colander, water splashing across the counter, and sprinted for the door. By the time she reached the porch, the scene had already escalated. "Sir, let me see your hands," McKee shouted, his voice firm, rehearsed. Terrence raised his hands slightly, palms out. His voice was calm but firm. "I live here. You can check the mailbox. This is my property." Kellogg shook his head, taking a step closer. "We don't know that yet." "Show ID." Denise's voice cut across the yard. "He doesn't need to show you anything. He's standing on his own driveway." But her words didn't slow them. The second pair of officers had now arrived, fanning out, trying to box Terrence in. One of them glanced at Andre, who had come running down the steps to stand near his mom. The officer's hand twitched toward his holster. "Kid, step back." Andre's heart hammered in his chest. "I'm just holding a ball," he cried, lifting it higher to show it wasn't a weapon. The orange leather looked absurd under the flashing lights, but still, the officer's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Neighbors had started filing out. Some whispered in disbelief, others just watched silently. A woman 2 houses over lifted her phone and began recording, her voice audible on the video. "He's just standing there. Why are they treating him like that?" Terrence kept his voice low, steady. "You don't need to scare my wife or my son. I haven't broken any law," but Officer McKee was convinced he was dealing with someone dangerous. His voice grew harsher. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll place you under arrest." Last warning. Denise's hands shook, clutching her phone, debating whether to call someone. Who, though? The police were already here. "You're harassing him," she shouted, her voice breaking. "He served this country, and you're treating him like—" "Ma'am, step back before we detain you too," Kellogg interrupted coldly. The words cut through her like glass. For a second, she froze. Detain her? In front of her child? On her own front lawn? Andre's voice cracked. "Stop yelling at my mom." That drew eyes again. Officers, neighbors. Everyone turned toward the boy, his small frame standing defiantly between his parents. The moment was fragile, charged. Terrence clenched his jaw but didn't move, his body language a mix of discipline and restraint. He knew this posture, calm under pressure, even as adrenaline surged. He'd stood like this in Afghan villages, in Iraqi streets, surrounded by armed men. But the difference now was that his son was watching. His wife was pleading. And the men in uniform weren't allies. They were treating him like an intruder on the very property his name was signed onto. Inside, Denise's words echoed in Terrence's head. What happens when their thinking puts us in danger? This was the answer playing out in real time. Officer McKee stepped forward again, hand outstretched, pushing at Terrence's chest. "Hands on the hood." Now the crowd gasped. Andre dropped his ball, the thud echoing across the driveway. Denise's scream tore through the night, and Terrence didn't budge. But the officers weren't ready to back down, and what happened next would decide whether this night ended in restraint or in disaster. The shove landed square on Terrence's chest, but the man didn't stumble. He didn't even flinch. His body stayed rooted, solid, as though the cruiser itself would have shifted before he did. That calmness, the refusal to break under pressure, only seemed to agitate the officers more. Denise's voice pierced the air. "Stop pushing him. He hasn't done anything." Andre clung to her side, eyes darting between his father and the four uniforms. He had never seen his dad look like this before, still silent, unshaken. To Andre, it was almost scarier than if Terrence had yelled. "Sir, I won't ask you again," Officer McKee barked, stepping closer, his breath hot, his posture squared. His right hand hovered near his holster like a threat. Terrence looked him in the eye and said, steady as a stone, "I will not be treated like a criminal in my own yard." The words were deliberate, not shouted, not defensive, just clear. They hung in the air, making even the neighbors holding up their phones pause. A silence lingered, broken only by Denise's ragged breathing. Kellogg glanced around at the crowd forming. "We need to de-escalate," he muttered under his breath. But McKee wasn't listening. His pride had been pricked, his authority questioned, and he wasn't used to people standing their ground. The second shove came harder. "Hands on the hood!" Terrence's feet shifted half an inch, but that was it. His arms stayed loose at his sides. His face didn't change. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low enough that only McKee could hear. "You're making a mistake that's bigger than you know." McKee sneered. "You think you're scaring me?" From the porch, Denise couldn't take it anymore. She stepped down 2 stairs, trembling with fury. "This is harassment. He fought for this country while you were still in high school. You think this makes you brave?" "Ma'am, back on the porch," Kellogg barked, moving toward her. Andre broke free from his mother's grasp, stumbling forward a few feet. His voice cracked under the weight of his fear. "He's my dad!" "He's not dangerous." That small voice pierced the scene like a siren. For the first time, one of the younger officers, the rookie of the group, hesitated. His eyes flicked between Andre's trembling hands and Terrence's steady stance. This didn't look like a criminal confrontation. This looked like a family being cornered. Phones were everywhere now. Neighbors had stepped into their yards, some whispering to each other, others speaking openly. A man across the street called out, "He lives there!" "I've seen him. Why are you treating him like this?" McKee turned his head just long enough to bark back, "Stay on your property, sir." His voice carried authority, but his eyes betrayed the first flicker of doubt. Terrence seized the moment. He didn't raise his voice, but he projected it, the way he'd once done in briefing rooms filled with soldiers. "You are pointing your suspicion at the wrong man, and if you keep pushing, you're going to regret how far this goes." It was a statement of fact, not a threat, but the weight of it settled on the entire block. Denise wiped her tears angrily. "How many of you does it take to threaten one man on his own lawn?" Andre stepped closer to his dad now, his small frame standing just a few feet away. "You're scaring my mom," he said to the officers, his voice soft but cutting. The rookie shifted uneasily again. "Maybe we should call this in," he said under his breath, but McKee shot him a glare. "We're handling it." "Handling it?" Denise spat. "You're humiliating yourselves in front of the whole neighborhood." One of the neighbors' phones caught the moment McKee raised his hand, pressing it against Terrence's shoulder to force him toward the car, and once again, Terrence didn't move. Instead, he angled his body slightly, forcing the officer to realize just how immovable he was. This wasn't ordinary strength. This was training, discipline, and control. The kind that couldn't be taught at a police academy. McKee's face flushed with frustration. He snapped, "What are you hiding? Why won't you comply?" Terrence's eyes narrowed. "Because I don't answer to harassment, and I don't bow to intimidation. Not from you, not from anyone." The words landed heavy. Denise clasped her hands over her mouth, terrified at what would come next. Andre's knees trembled, but he stood tall beside his father anyway. The standoff had drawn a crowd now, nearly 20 people lining the street, phones raised, murmurs spreading. The officers shifted, realizing this wasn't just another call they could control with force. Every action was being recorded, every word immortalized. And in that moment, Terrence made a choice. He would reveal a sliver of who he truly was, not to boast, not to shame, but to make them understand the weight of their mistake. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the flashing lights and murmurs. I've commanded men in places you couldn't imagine. I've faced enemies who didn't give me the courtesy of asking for my ID. And yet, here I am, being treated like a criminal on the same soil I bled to protect. The rookie officer froze, his eyes widening. The crowd gasped. Denise's sob turned into stunned silence. McKee blinked, uncertain now. What are you saying? Terrence held his stare. I'm saying you don't know who you're dealing with. But you will. But the revelation didn't end the confrontation. It only shifted it, forcing everyone present to rethink who was standing in that driveway and what lines had already been crossed. The silence that followed Terrence's words was louder than the shouting had been. For a moment, even the flashing lights seemed to slow, casting the whole block in red and blue shadows that stretched across the lawns. The crowd was buzzing with whispers now, their cameras fixed on the man who hadn't budged despite 2 shoves and the full weight of authority pressing down on him. Denise stepped closer, her voice trembling but clear. Tell them, Terrence. Tell them who you are. Terrence's eyes stayed locked on Officer McKee. I shouldn't have to. Andre looked up at his father, tears shining in his eyes. Dad, please. They're not listening. The boy's words twisted the knife inside Terrence's chest. He had trained soldiers, mentored men who were terrified before their first mission, taught them how to stay calm when chaos broke loose. But nothing had prepared him for the look on his son's face, that mix of fear and disbelief that his father could be treated like this on his own front lawn. McKee sneered. What, you some kind of big shot? Military? Don't care, you still answer to me here. That was the spark, the flicker that lit the fire Terrence had been holding back. He stepped forward, closing the gap, his voice suddenly commanding, sharp, impossible to ignore. You will not put your hands on me again. The rookie flinched. Even Kellogg, who had been backing McKee the whole time, shifted uneasily. There was something in Terrence's tone that didn't sound like bravado. It sounded like authority, like a man who had given orders that determined life and death. Denise reached for Andre's shoulder, pulling him back slightly, but she didn't stop her husband. She knew the look in his eyes. She'd seen it before, years earlier, when he returned from deployments with that same steel in his gaze, the look of a man carrying too much but refusing to bend. McKee, trying to hold ground, raised his voice again. I said, hands on the hood. Terrence raised his own voice for the first time, and it cut through the night like a blade. You don't order me. Not here. Not now. Not after what I've given to this country. The crowd stirred. Someone called out, tell them who you are. Another shouted, he served. The weight of witnesses grew heavier by the second. Terrence took a breath, his chest rising, his tone shifting into something undeniable. I commanded men in Delta Force. I led missions in Kandahar, in Mosul, in places you can't even pronounce. I've walked through firefights you couldn't survive 5 minutes in, and you think pushing me against a hood is going to break me? The words hit like thunder. McKee's smirk faltered. Kellogg's eyes darted to the rookie, who looked pale now, his grip loosening on his holster. Denise whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Finally. Andre's mouth hung open, staring at his father in awe and disbelief. He had known his dad was military, but he had never heard it said like this, never heard him declare it with such force. McKee, cornered in his pride, spat back. I don't care who you think you are. You follow my orders, or you go to jail. Terrence's eyes darkened. I've stared down men with rifles aimed at my head and didn't blink. You think your badge gives you more power than them? You're wrong. The only reason I'm still standing here calm is because I won't give my son the memory of seeing his father dragged across his own yard. Andre's breath caught. He felt the truth of it. His dad wasn't afraid of these officers. He was protecting him, protecting the family from trauma they'd never forget. The neighbors had grown bolder now. One woman shouted, "You're going after the wrong man." Another, holding her phone high, yelled, "This is harassment." The tension broke slightly, not for the officers, but for the onlookers. They were realizing in real time what was happening. A veteran, a man who had given his life to service, was being treated as a suspect in front of his wife and son, Kellogg finally spoke, his voice quieter, almost uncertain. Maybe we should regroup. McKee shot him a look of disbelief. What, back down? You kidding me? But Terrence cut in, his words sharp. Backing down isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Something you clearly weren't taught. The rookie lowered his hand fully from his holster, his voice almost trembling. Sir, maybe we should call the sergeant in. This doesn't feel right. McKee cursed under his breath. His authority was slipping, not just in front of the McMillans, but in front of his fellow officers, the neighbors, the cameras, the entire block. Denise squeezed Andre's shoulder, whispering, It's shifting. Do you see it? They know. Terrence exhaled, not in relief, but in control. His voice dropped lower, quieter, but it carried farther than the sirens. You will walk away tonight, and when you go back to your station, you'll remember that you put your hands on a Delta Force commander who has bled for this country while you harassed his wife and son. That memory is going to follow you long after this night is over. McKee's face burned. He wanted to fight, but the crowd had grown too large. Cameras too many. The rookie too rattled. Even Kellogg was no longer standing firmly at his side. For the first time that evening, the officers stepped back. The standoff wasn't over, not yet, but the tide had shifted. Terrence had taken control without raising a hand, without throwing a punch, only with words, with truth, with the gravity of who he was. But the confrontation on Sycamore Lane didn't just end with the officers stepping back. It rippled through the neighborhood and the department, forcing everyone to reckon with what they had just witnessed. By the next morning, Sycamore Lane felt different. The flashing lights were gone, but the weight of the night before clung to every house. Neighbors who had watched from behind curtains now whispered across lawns, passing the story from one porch to another. Videos had already begun circulating, shaky phone footage showing officers shoving Terrence, Denise screaming, Andre's frightened voice echoing through the dark. It wasn't just gossip now, it was evidence. Denise sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug she hadn't sipped from. I can't believe they did that to you, she whispered, staring at her husband. Terrence leaned back in his chair, shoulders heavy. I can, he said simply. His voice carried no surprise, just exhaustion. This wasn't the first time. Won't be the last, Andre, still replaying everything in his head, pushed his cereal bowl away. Dad, when you told them who you were, why didn't they stop right away? Shouldn't that mean something? Terrence looked at his son for a long moment before answering. Respect doesn't always come with the uniform, son. Some people only see what they want to see. The boy frowned, fists clenched. That's not fair. No, Terrence said quietly. It's not. Out on the street, neighbors divided themselves into camps. Some walked up the McMillans' driveway offering words of support. John Ramirez, who lived 3 doors down, rang the bell that afternoon. I just want to say, I saw the whole thing. I'm telling everyone what really happened. That wasn't right, Denise thanked him, though her smile was thin, weighed down by fatigue. But not every neighbor felt the same. Linda Robards, the woman who had once critiqued Terrence's lawn, was overheard telling another resident, well, if he'd just done what the officers asked, none of this would have happened. When Denise heard that through the grapevine, her chest tightened. So it's our fault they shoved him? Our fault they screamed at our son? She muttered under her breath. That evening, the Neighborhood Homeowners Association called an urgent meeting in the community clubhouse. Denise refused to go. Terrence went anyway, knowing silence would only give others room to twist the truth. The room buzzed with tension when he entered. Some neighbors wouldn't meet his eyes. Others patted his back as he walked to the center. Finally, the HOA president cleared her throat. We've received concerns about last night. Some residents feel unsafe. Others feel law enforcement overreacted. We need to address this. Terrence stood, hands clasped in front of him. His voice was calm but firm. Unsafe? He paused, scanning the faces. The only people unsafe last night were my wife and my son, watching 4 armed officers treat me like a criminal in my own yard. You all saw it. You all heard it. Some of you recorded it. Tell me, was there anything unsafe about me walking back from my mailbox with a letter in my hand? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few heads shook. Others looked down at the floor. I didn't ask for a spectacle, Terrence continued. I asked to live here quietly, same as anyone else. I wore this country's uniform for 20 years. I've stood in places you couldn't imagine, so my family could have nights that were ordinary. But what I saw on my driveway last night, what my son saw, wasn't ordinary. It was wrong, and it's not going to be brushed under the rug. The room went silent. Afterward, John Ramirez caught him at the door. People are talking, Terrence. The videos are getting traction online. It's not just the neighborhood anymore. This is bigger. And he was right. By the following day, clips from Sycamore Lane had hit local news. Anchors replayed the footage on loop. A man standing firm as officers shoved him, a woman screaming, a teenager's voice cracking in panic. The headline read, "Veteran harassed in his own driveway." The police department scrambled. A spokesperson issued a statement that afternoon. "We are aware of the incident on Sycamore Lane and are conducting a full internal review." But the McMillans knew what that really meant. A review wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. It was a way to stall, to keep the public calm while the department figured out damage control. At dinner that night, Denise slammed her fork down. They're already spinning it, saying they were responding to a suspicious call. Suspicious? You were picking up the mail. Terrence reached across the table, covering her hand with his. They'll try to twist it. That's what institutions do. But the truth is out there now. People saw Andre leaned forward, eyes fierce. So what happens now? Terrence studied him. His son wasn't just scared anymore. He was angry. And anger, Terrence knew, was dangerous, if not guided. What happens now, he said slowly, is we show them what it means to stand with dignity. We don't fight fire with fire. We fight it with truth. Andre tilted his head. But what if they don't listen? Terrence exhaled, his voice softer. Then we keep standing until they can't ignore us anymore. The boy nodded, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He had seen his father resist 4 officers without lifting a finger. He had seen his mother cry and beg for mercy, and he had seen his neighbors split between support and suspicion. The lesson was clear, even if Andre didn't want it to be. Sometimes, doing everything right still wasn't enough. But the night's impact didn't stop at the neighborhood or the evening news. It would force a conversation at the department level, one that couldn't be avoided once Terrence's name reached the desks of people in power. 2 days later, Terrence stood in front of the Franklin Police Department. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as reporters clustered near the steps, microphones ready. Word had spread fast. Delta Force veteran harassed on his own property. And now, the department was under scrutiny. Denise stood beside him, her hand in his. Andre lingered just behind, still shaken, but determined not to hide. A journalist called out first, "Mr. McMillan, what do you want from the police after this incident?" Terrence's voice carried the same weight it had that night in his driveway, firm, measured, undeniable. "I want what every citizen wants, respect, accountability, and the assurance that no man, woman, or child has to prove their worthiness to stand in front of their own home." The crowd quieted. He paused, scanning the reporters, the neighbors who had come to watch, even the officers standing stiffly behind the glass doors. "I spent 2 decades of my life defending freedoms most people take for granted. I didn't do it for medals or recognition. I did it so my family and yours could live without fear of being treated like strangers in their own neighborhoods." His words weren't theatrical. They were plain, direct, heavy with truth. Denise squeezed his hand tighter. She whispered, "They're listening." Andre stepped forward, surprising everyone. His voice cracked, but he pushed through it. "That night, I thought they were going to take my dad away. I thought I was going to lose him." His throat tightened, but he continued, "I'll never forget how he stood there. Not because he was stronger than them, but because he wouldn't let them make him small." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. For the first time, the story wasn't just about the officers. It was about the lesson etched into that driveway confrontation. Later that week, the chief of police invited Terrence to a closed-door meeting. The department wanted the controversy to fade, but they also knew ignoring him wasn't an option. Sitting across a polished oak table, the chief tried to sound measured. "Mr. McMillan, we regret the misunderstanding." Terrence leaned forward, his tone steady. "Misunderstanding is when someone gets the wrong directions to a restaurant. What happened on my lawn was harassment. and it could have ended in tragedy. The chief shifted uncomfortably, realizing this wasn't a man who could be placated with polite words. When Terrence left the meeting, Denise asked him, "Did you get through to them?" He exhaled, glancing at her. "I don't know, but I told them the truth. And the truth has a way of sticking, even when people try to ignore it." At home that night, Andre sat with his father on the porch. The air was warm, the cicadas humming in the trees. He looked at his dad, eyes wide, curious. "Were you scared?" Terrence thought for a long moment before answering. "Yes, but not for me. I was scared for you. Scared you'd grow up thinking this is normal." Andre swallowed hard. "What should I do if it ever happens again?" "If it's me next time?" Terrence turned to him, his voice soft but firm. "You stand tall, you stay calm, and you never forget who you are. Don't let anyone make you forget." The boy nodded, his young face etched with a seriousness beyond his years. From across the street, neighbors watched quietly. Some waved, others avoided eye contact. But the McMillans didn't need everyone's approval. What mattered was that the story had been told, the truth had been seen, and silence was no longer an option. As the days went on, the videos from that night continued to circulate. People who had never heard the name Terrence McMillan now debated it over dinner tables and online forums. Some defended the officers, others condemned them. But beneath the noise, one lesson kept surfacing. Dignity isn't given, it's claimed, even when the world tries to strip it away. Terrence knew the fight wasn't over. There would be other battles, some in public, some in private. But he also knew this. His son had seen him refuse to bend. His wife had seen him protect without raising a hand. And his neighbors had seen what true restraint and true strength looked like. That was enough to carry forward. And as Terrence rose from the porch that night, looking at the quiet street where it had all happened, he turned to Andre with a final word. "Remember this, son. Your worth isn't measured by how others treat you. It's measured by how you stand when they try to bring you down." Andre nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. The story of the McMillans wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about the choice to resist humiliation with dignity, the choice to meet aggression with truth, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, standing tall could light the way forward. And if you've followed this story until now, don't forget, subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the strength we all carry inside.